China strikes back against the U.S. Protests erupt in southern China over a secret government project. And Italy and China are building ties. This is China Uncensored. I'm Chris Chappell. This week's China News headlines. The United States is really angering Beijing with its new approach to China, actually standing up for American principles. I know, I never thought our politicians could do it either.
The U.S. House of Representatives overwhelmingly approved a bill aimed at China's crackdown on its Muslim minority. The Uyghur Act of 2019 calls for the closure of mass detention camps in the province of Xinjiang. It would see sanctions imposed on a member of China's Politburo for the first time.
Sanctioning a member of the Politburo is huge, unprecedented.
We are sending a message to Beijing. America is watching, and we will not stand silent.
The Uyghurs are an ethnic group that lives here in the Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region. For more on how autonomous the Chinese Communist Party lets the Uyghurs be, here's Republican Congressman Chris Smith.
Children ripped from the warm embrace of their families to be indoctrinated in communist ideology and forced to renounce their religious culture and language. Rape, sexual abuse, and forced abortions of women being held in internment camps. Forced labor on a scale that allows Chinese companies to profit from modern-day slavery.
You know, that's almost heartwarming. Not the rape in modern-day slavery. That's terrible. I'm talking about Democrats and Republicans working together. Chinese Communist Party, it brings America together. The U.S. Senate has passed a similar bill, but now they have to vote again on the House version before it goes to President Trump to sign. This Uyghur Human Rights Policy Act comes shortly after Congress pretty much unanimously passed the Hong Kong Human Rights and Democracy Act and the Protect Hong Kong Act. And President Trump signed those into law last week, in spite of Beijing's objections, after the media freaked out that he might not sign the bills, and then freaked out when he did sign the bills. But even if the media coverage is a bit haywire, the important thing is that the House of Representatives, the Senate, and the White House all agree on standing up for freedom and democracy and calling out China's human rights issues. As you can imagine, the Chinese Communist Party is not happy about all this unity and talk of freedom and democracy. They've worked so hard for years to keep other countries from criticizing them. Why isn't it working anymore? And so, the empire strikes back. The Chinese empire strikes back.
Beijing on Wednesday furiously condemned a piece of American legislation calling for a tougher U.S. response to China's treatment of Muslim minorities. A foreign ministry spokeswoman warned the bill could impact negotiations aimed at ending a grueling trade war between Washington and Beijing.
Do you believe that if the U.S. takes measures to hurt China's interests, we will just sit back and let it happen? I think for every erroneous action, an appropriate price must be paid. An appropriate price must be paid.
Oh my gosh, what are they going to do?
Several sources familiar with Beijing's stance told Reuters that the bill could jeopardize the so-called Phase 1 deal already fraught with disagreements and complications.
Oh no, it could jeopardize the trade deal. How could things possibly get worse? Oh geez, they suspended U.S. port calls? What a nightmare. Anything else? What? They're sanctioning American nonprofit groups? No. I'm sorry, folks, but the U.S. can't stand up for human rights and democracy anymore. The price is just too high. But the trade war, you say? Well, let's see what's going on there. It hasn't been great for China's economy. Capital investment by Chinese firms saw its lowest growth in 3 years. According to a Reuters analysis, that's because a weakening economy, tight credit, and prolonged trade war with the United States dent sales growth and cash reserves. So the longer the trade war goes on, the more it hurts the Chinese economy. And now, Trump says he may have to keep it going till after the U.S. presidential election next year. Meanwhile, more mid-sized American companies are moving out of China. Now that doesn't mean they're coming back to America. Some are considering that, but a lot of other ones are just diversifying their supply chains to other Asian countries. So you might be seeing fewer made-in-China products and more made in Vietnam. Good old freedom-loving communist Vietnam. But there's one business that's apparently booming in China. This is Yiwu City in Zhejiang province. I talked about the city before on a Christmas episode. The Chinese city that makes your Christmas. They manufacture everything. Loads of Christmas items, sure, but also a lot of the flags of the world. Not just country flags, but political slogan flags. And they're predicting Trump will be re-elected. See, in 2016, 5 months before the last presidential election, the people of Yiwu noticed more people were ordering Trump flags than Clinton flags. And so they predicted that Trump would win. Yes, a tiny Chinese manufacturing city was more accurate at predicting election results than the New York Times. Of course, the 2020 election is still a ways out. Maybe 5 months before the election, the good people of Yiwu might notice people ordering a very different flag. But while relations between China and the US may be strained, relations between China and Russia are doing great. They just opened a natural gas pipeline linking Siberia to northeastern China. It's the biggest energy project for Russia since the fall of the Soviet Union. How nice for them. This is part of what the Chinese Communist Party is calling the Polar Silk Road. China wants a slice of the shipping lanes and natural resources of the Arctic. The U.S. Geological Survey estimates the Arctic holds about 13% of the world's undiscovered oil reserves and 30% of the natural gas reserves. The northernmost part of China is still almost 1,000 miles from the Arctic Circle. But don't worry, China is still labeling itself a near-Arctic state. And that means our new Cold War can happen in a place that's actually pretty cold. Speaking of frosty relationships, the Chinese telecom giant Huawei is in trouble. And for once, not with the US, but actually inside China. Apparently there's been a huge social media backlash inside China against the company, which is bad because the Chinese government has been trying to make Huawei a rallying point for patriotism. Except new details came to light in the case of a former employee who was arrested and jailed for 251 days following an unproven accusation of blackmail from the company. Yeah, that's not a good look. According to the New York Times, many Chinese proudly abandoned their iPhones for Huawei phones. But the backlash to the jailing of a longtime employee after a labor dispute has made it clear that people in China are starting to sour on the company. And Huawei is getting on the wrong side of the US too. According to the US Commerce Secretary, Huawei is trying to convince its suppliers to break the law by moving offshore. Huawei is on a US trade blacklist over national security concerns, but it's hard to enforce that on overseas suppliers. So Huawei is trying to convince American suppliers to get around US national security concerns by going overseas. So I'm in the market for a new phone, but there's no way I'll do Huawei. I would just like to remind everyone that the China-Pakistan friendship is unbreakable. Also, more than 600 Pakistani girls were sex trafficked to Chinese men. But don't worry, that's going to stop. Not the sex trafficking, that will continue. The investigation into the sex trafficking, that will stop. According to AP, officials with knowledge of the investigation say that is because of pressure from government officials fearful of hurting Pakistan's lucrative ties to Beijing. So you see, when the US State Department labeled China as one of the worst human trafficking offenders, they got it all wrong. China is the best human trafficking offender. Speaking of unbridled disasters, remember that Chinese scientist who genetically engineered actual human twin babies? He edited a gene to make the twins immune to HIV. Too bad he couldn't make himself immune to public backlash and house arrest. Speaking of not actually being immune, the twins. Turns out the twin girls are probably not immune to HIV. That was a lie. But they may have unintended mutations. And finally, Batman has run afoul of Chinese censors. Frank Miller's new graphic novel, The Dark Knight Returns: The Golden Child, uses this image of a young Batman throwing a Molotov cocktail. But my favorite state-run media, the Global Times, helped set off a firestorm of criticism in China by saying it was a reference to Hong Kong protests, or riots as they call it. After the backlash, DC Comics showed that it knows a thing or two about heroes, and how not to act like one. They quickly removed the image, which led, I'm happy to say, to more backlash against DC. And don't go anywhere, because after the break, people in China are furious over a secret government project. Welcome back to China Uncensored. I'm Chris Chappell. Big protests over the weekend, and this time, not in Hong Kong. Okay, also in Hong Kong. But I'm talking about the protests in Wunlo. Wunlo is a small township in Guangdong province. It's a couple hundred miles west of Hong Kong. Local authorities had asked residents there to give up their farmland so they could build a 24-acre park. They dubbed it the Huazhou Humanity and Ecology Park, which sounds just lovely. But then last week, residents found out a dirty little secret. The Humanity and Ecology Park would also contain a crematorium. You know, to burn bodies of dead people. I don't think that local residents were expecting the park to have that kind of humanity. When residents found out, they were not happy. Last Thursday, they went to the local government office to protest. Residents had felt cheated because authorities kept the crematorium secret. Residents were also worried the crematorium would cause pollution and contaminate the water supply. Plus, you know, burning dead people near a residential area is really bad feng shui. The site is close to housing and the source of our drinking water, a woman told the South China Morning Post. We're afraid of pollution. We don't want money or compensation, we just want the crematorium project scrapped. So Chinese authorities did what Chinese authorities do best. They sat down for a dialogue with local protest leaders and, just kidding, they sent in the riot police. These people held a banner that says, "Love our beautiful Wunlo town, say no to crematorium." Of course you need riot police. Holding a banner is very subversive. If you really loved your town, you'd embrace the government's plan to burn dead people in the middle of it. In any case, the protest didn't end well. The police fired tear gas and charged the protesters. Around 100 people were reportedly arrested and a dozen or so were said to be injured, including a child, and this elderly woman who was allegedly beaten by the police. And there were other reports of police brutality, including police dragging an unconscious young protester in an alley. Definitely the kind of thing that would make me want to go cow tipping on police cars. One resident told The Guardian that now police are like crazy dogs, beating whoever they see. That's a bit unfair. In some cases, the police didn't beat people. They just launched tear gas at them. Crazy dogs? Ha! Find me a dog that can operate a tear gas launcher. At any rate, the protests in Wunlo are not actually that unique in China. There are tens of thousands of protests a year across the country, what central authorities call mass incidents. Most of them are small, often a dozen or fewer people. But occasionally, mass incidents involve several hundred or even over 1,000 people, like the one in Wunlo. But what really sets Chinese authorities on edge is that Wunlo is only a couple hundred miles from Hong Kong. And they're worried that subversive ideas like freedom and representative government could spread from Hong Kong to other parts of China. In the end, authorities in Wunlo put a freeze on the crematorium plan. But the standoff between police and protesters goes on. That's because the public had no confidence in the government, as it had agreed only to suspend the crematorium project rather than cancel it. Wow, that reminds me of Hong Kong, where the government agreed only to suspend a controversial extradition bill, but not actually cancel it. At least not until protests had gone on for 3 months. And by then, the protests had become about a lot more than just the one extradition bill. Of course, there's a key difference between protests in Wunlo and Hong Kong. Protesters in Wunlo are asking the local government to stop building a crematorium, and the Communist Party can compromise by stopping construction and then throwing local officials under the bus. But in Hong Kong, protesters are asking for freedom, and that's a serious threat to the Communist Party's power. So they're not going to compromise on that. And coming up after the break, Shelley investigates secret Chinese sweatshops in Italy. Welcome back to China Uncensored. I'm Chris Chappell. In the 13th century, Venetian explorer Marco Polo visited China. There, he allegedly learned the secret of making noodles and brought it back to Italy to make a knockoff version called spaghetti. But now, China is learning something from Italy. Shelley Zhang went to Italy to find out more.
Italy and China have been friends since, well, ancient times. And that's something that Chinese leader Xi Jinping emphasized during his trip to Italy back in March of this year. That trip was when Italian and Chinese authorities signed a memorandum of understanding, making Italy the first major Western economy to join China's Belt and Road Initiative, also known as One Belt, One Way to get debt-ridden European countries to do your bidding. But while the MOU itself was extremely vague, with commitments to work towards and explore ways and enhance dialogue, Italy and China also signed 2.5 billion euros worth of trade deals, linking their economies for years to come. But over the last decade plus, China has already had more and more influence over Italy's economy. One example is the millions of Chinese tourists who visit Venice and other Italian cities each year. Chinese tourists are welcomed by Italian businesses for being high spenders. And the Italian government has been encouraging more Chinese tourism, including with PR stunts, like briefly having Chinese police patrol popular tourist destinations like Venice. Although given the reputation of Chinese police in China, I'm not sure that makes anyone feel safer. But China has also been affecting the economics of tourist souvenirs. As in many parts of the world, the vast majority of souvenirs sold in Venice are made in China. And it's not just cheap hats and scarves. It's affecting traditional Venetian crafts. No, traditional Venetian crafts, like these masks, which have been made by hand here in Venice for hundreds of years. They're now being replaced with Chinese factory-made plastic versions sold at a fraction of the price. And everywhere I went, I saw stores selling discount leather bags. Except these discount bags say made in Italy. Are they counterfeits? No, it's much more complicated than that. And the answer lies here in Prato. With almost 200,000 people, Prato is the third largest city in central Italy. And it's been famous for making textiles since the Middle Ages. Well, textiles and biscotti. But outside Prato's medieval walls, the face of the city's textile industry has changed rapidly in the last 20 years. This is the Via Pistoiese, home to Prato's Chinatown. Officially, around 20,000 Chinese people live in Prato, but the actual number may be almost triple that due to illegal immigration. Prato has the highest concentration of Chinese immigrants in Italy, and almost all of them are from the city of Wenzhou in China's Zhejiang province. Back in the 1990s, Chinese immigrants came to Prato to work in the textile factories, and then to buy the textile factories. By then, many Italian-owned factories were losing business to cheaper fabrics made in, well, China. But instead of making fabric, the Chinese factories in Prato would import fabric from China and make cheap, fast fashion, undercutting the locals. They eventually got into the lucrative leather goods market too, all technically made in Italy by Chinese workers. We walked through the back streets of Prato and secretly filmed some of these Chinese fast fashion factories. Hidden behind unmarked steel doors, these were small operations. Less than a dozen people, mostly at sewing machines. Some of the workers we talked to were worried that we might be from the Italian government. The Italian government has conducted a lot of raids on Chinese factories, following reports of sweatshop conditions, illegal workers, and unpaid taxes. We did witness some questionable safety practices. Remember, kids, don't sew and smoke. And workers at the types of factories we saw have talked about working long hours and sleeping in the factories. But some Chinese factory owners feel unfairly targeted, especially since they've revived the economy of places like Prato. For example, Chinese factories may evade taxes, but you could argue that in Italy, tax evasion is practically a national pastime. And not all Chinese factories are the sweatshop-like places we visited. Outside Prato's Chinatown are higher-end Chinese factories and showrooms. Some of these make products for famous Italian fashion houses like Prada and Gucci. And that's given rise to a Chinese middle class in Prato. Some Chinese immigrants have even built an entire economy around these factories, setting up supermarkets, restaurants, even a whole street of wedding-related businesses to cater to a growing Chinese community. I mean, who wouldn't want to eat at Ravioli Leo's? But critics say the Chinese money isn't going into the Italian economy. Back in 2017, the state-owned Bank of China was forced to pay Italy more than 20 million euros connected to a money laundering case. Prosecutors allege that more than 4.5 billion euros had been smuggled to China from Italy by Chinese people living mainly in Florence and the nearby city of Prato. Half of that was through the Bank of China. And there's an even darker side to this economic growth. Last year, Italian authorities busted what they say was a Chinese mafia group based in Prato, one that was involved in gambling, prostitution, and trucking Chinese goods across Europe. As we walked around Prato, we saw several gambling halls and lots of these flyers advertising massage parlors. This one offers very pretty 18-year-old girls who've just come from China. Prostitution is legal in Italy, but organized prostitution and brothels are not. Social workers told an Al Jazeera reporter that in these cases, there could be human trafficking involved. According to the UN, there are lots of Chinese victims of human trafficking in Italy. They could end up doing forced labor in textile factories in cities like Prato, or doing sex work in apartments and massage parlors. Prato, with all of its complications, is a microcosm of how globalization has linked the Chinese and Italian economies. And that's before the Chinese and Italian officials started talking about even more cooperation. After the two countries signed the Belt and Road Agreement, Italy's deputy prime minister praised it as a day when Made in Italy has won. But as a trip through Prato shows, China is changing what Made in Italy means. Chinese companies, often exploiting workers in the same factory conditions they'd have in mainland China, can legally take advantage of the high-quality Made in Italy brand, until that brand loses its meaning and the money leaves the country. So ultimately, the one who benefits from this Made in Italy partnership might just be China.
Thanks, Shelley. So what do you think? Leave your comments below. And remember, China Uncensored is funded mainly through viewer contributions. Visit patreon.com/China Uncensored and contribute $1 or more per episode. Your support allows us to keep making great episodes like this. Once again, I'm Chris Chappell. Thanks for watching China Uncensored.